diferentes acciones en conjunto que viabilizan. Multisolución, por ponérselo digamos, en la respuesta, específicamente para este caso de este campo. Se hicieron fácilmente 3 o 4 cambios en la planeación, diferentes diseños mecánicos, diferente selección de revestimiento, en la misma fase, mitigación para arenamiento, o sea, control de drawdown para producción. No les gusta mucho porque pues sacrifica temas de producción, pero pues se tienen en cuenta porque se ponen en la balanza. Te mencioné 4. Se me escapan probablemente otros 2. Entonces, así es como lo manejamos para este campo. Probablemente hay otros campos menos complejos, ¿no? De pronto una única problemática, una única solución o solo 2. Gracias, Gabriel.
Bueno, Hernán, gracias por la presentación, muy chévere. Quisiera dar una preguntita. Aparte de, digamos, de lo que ustedes tienen que recomendar, digamos, de, bueno, cuál voy a comprar, qué grado, ¿cierto? De acero tengo que comprar el casing, todo eso. Ustedes también, digamos, van hasta el punto de decir, digamos, cuántos, aparte del diseño de los tiros por pie de un cañoneo, porque vi una lámina, ahí estaba tratando de leer, pero lo pasaste rápido, porque tiene un efecto realmente sobre el material. Sí. Entonces, no sé si ustedes como equipo entran también como decir, venga, pueden cañonear a tantos tiros por pie, pero recuerden que nosotros tenemos unos pozos que al cañonear los tantos tiros por pie, el factor o digamos el porcentaje en el efecto, el porcentaje en el daño, el revestimiento, tiene que ver con eso. Entonces, no sé si ustedes entran en esa partecita, aparte de hacer uno el diseño de cuántos tiros por pie y todo el cuento. Gracias.
Sí lo hacemos, pero nuevamente, para este caso, para este campo particular, no es el Pareto la distribución de tiros por pie, el tipo de cañoneo, vista pérdida de resistencia en el material. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí nos colapsamos y nos deformamos en zonas diferentes a las cañoneadas. Entonces, digamos, ahí no hay problema. Pero sí, gracias por mencionarlo, en el tema de geomecánica y de arenamiento sí identificamos que era clave, Pareto e importante la orientación de los cañoneos, la tipología del cañoneo, la densidad de disparos para que el arenamiento no fuese tan grande, tan alto y el impacto fuese menor en toda la problemática. O sea, entre menos le aportemos a todas esas causas, pues menos problema o el problema va a ser de menor. Entonces sí lo tenemos en cuenta, pero para este caso específico no tiene relevancia en la cantidad de disparos y en la pérdida de material, de resistencia al material en la zona cañonera.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Hernán, y otro punto sobre lo que mencionabas ya cuando estaban construyendo el modelo, ¿no? Digamos, de esto del ajuste del modelo en términos de roca y cemento, pero digamos que no en términos del revestimiento. Digamos que ese ajuste que se hace basado en los registros, ¿sí? Y tú hablas de porcentaje, es grueso, pero creo que es una buena forma de verlo. Yo ajusto un 50% basado en el registro desde el punto de vista de daño en la roca, de daño en el mismo cemento. No obstante, cuando uno revisa con la gente de registros y un poco la letra menuda en todos estos reportes de registros, lo que concluye uno, por lo menos en términos de daño de revestimiento, es que la incertidumbre de las herramientas aún hoy en día sigue siendo muy alta. Entonces, quizá cuando se ajustan los modelos, valdría la pena tener un factor y digamos, incluir esa incertidumbre del registro, porque fácilmente puede ser también un 30%, que de pronto yo no estoy viendo, yo estoy preguntando, venga, ¿por qué no veo el daño del revestimiento? Pero pues si yo tengo una incertidumbre alta en el registro, pues también voy a tener digamos, esa incertidumbre ahí.
Sí, eso, digamos, procuramos dentro de los modelos, como la data entrada para modelos, pues son esos registros. Sí, tienes razón, hay zonas de muy baja calidad que a veces no tomamos en cuenta dentro de los modelos por su baja calidad. ¿Qué hicimos también acá? Como teníamos tanta incertidumbre desde los registros en adelante, pues hicimos sensibilidades, tratamos de sacar sensibilidades para dar esa selección al final y darle un rango al que diseña y al que planea. Entonces hicimos sensibilidades, bueno, ¿qué pasará cuando yo use este revestimiento y estoy en un rango ¿cierto? De lo que veo en un registro, porque el registro me muestra, ustedes vieron, hay tuberías que prácticamente estaban cerradas, o sea, totalmente deformadas, colapsadas por ovalización o por shear, lo que fuese, y pues yo le creo a esos registros, porque al final yo calibro los modelos con eso. Como el modelo me dice cuánto se mueve, yo me llevo y comparo con lo del registro. Pero sí, para mitigar un poco ese tema, manejamos como rangos de sensibilidad, pero sí lo tenemos presente.
Ok, muchas gracias a todos. Gracias, Hernán. Un aplauso para Hernán, por favor. Bien, y para cerrar la jornada del día de hoy, tenemos la charla magistral vamos a ver si nos abre aquí. Que finalmente me llegó. De Steven Alan Cani, trabaja con Archer, trabaja en Dubái precisamente, pero es una persona que ha estado trabajando en la industria en diferentes partes del mundo y que nos trae un tema especialmente fuerte, sobre todo para el número de pozos que tenemos en el país, que es acerca de well decommissioning. Esta palabra en muchas áreas, sobre todo ahorita en el Catatumbo, no se puede mencionar porque las personas pues ven la presencia de la industria como una forma ya parte de la vida de ellos y parte del trabajo de ellos. Entonces, y esa particularidad que se tiene allí y que se tiene en otras áreas, por ejemplo, qué pasará en la industria en Barranca, en La Infantas, en Casabe, etcétera, no es solamente una problemática de Colombia, es una problemática a nivel mundial. Y es un punto también de estudio y análisis. Muchos de estos pozos, entonces, se está mirando antes de cerrarlo, antes de abandonarlo, cómo obtener otro poquito más de beneficio, ¿cierto? Y esa problemática es la que nos trae Stephen el día de hoy. So, welcome, Stephen, on your speech. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, and the floor is yours.
Gracias. So, unfortunately, I don't speak English. I speak Scottish. So we're going to have some fun today communicating. Let me just see. Firstly, thank you. Welcome. It was 32 and a half hours to get here. A very long trip, but thank you for having me. I've been to Bogota frequently. I've been to Cartagena. Very enjoyable. This is my first time in Busarama. So your hospitality has been excellent. And thank you for this opportunity. Also, firstly, thank the SPD Foundation. This is a program that SP funds to transfer knowledge into sector. It's a very rich program. I sat in distinguished lecturers as I started to learn and go up through my career. So it's an honor to be one this year and share my message, which is on well decommissioning with you. So well decommissioning is something we're terrible at, or I'll extend the comment. As a sector, we're terrible at reuse. We drill a well, we produce a well, and then we shut the well in and we leave the well. And the integrity gets worse, and the well performance is terrible, and we have thermal losses, and we don't ever learn as a sector how to decommission to then reuse. And that's a view that I developed as I was in North America, South America, Asia, Middle East, and my home country, which is UK. Across them all, we're terrible. We're excellent at drilling. We love to drill. We're terrible at late life. When wells get difficult, when reservoirs get tight, when barriers start to fail, we leave wells alone. And that's a massive challenge we have in sector. Now, what I've done is model the cash flow profile of a wellbore. And we can see through various phases how this behaves. Now, this is a large UK field, and we can see there's 9 years, and there's up to $720 million of investment. That's significant. So we identify reservoir, we shoot seismic, we then start to do E&A development, and then we come back and start to develop clusters and look at facility to install, to produce. So significant expenditure across this phase because the production reservoir volume and the revenue we can access is enormous, to be honest. It's huge. So we're very good at this. We're superb at this. We have extensive technology, and we have process that's very effective and efficient. We can appraise targets at any basin globally. Next phase, we go from CapEx into OpEx. We produce. So we start to produce initial development wells. We drill more development wells. We add tiebacks onto offshore platforms, or we add tiebacks to onshore fields. And the cash flow performance is incredible. At this point, an oil company is a bank, not an oil company. So again, we're excellent in OpEx. We're superb. The well comes online, it generates very strong cash performance, and then we see the curve start to flatten. And there's a few waves in the curve, and that's production profile falling off. That's new production coming in behind. And then ultimately we get to a point where it plateaus completely. So at this point, we say, okay, we're going to decommission. And the sector doesn't have a solid understanding on how to decommission yet. Even the North Sea, even the Gulf of Mexico. Say, okay, in this case, you're going to spend $700 to $800 million decommissioning. That's enormous. Now, if you get that wrong, you've wiped out all the cash flow of the asset through its life. If you get it right, you can save significant expenditure. So the challenge I see is we don't have sustainability or resilience on how we approach decommissioning, and then how we actually execute and learn. Excellent CapEx and OpEx. Move into ABEX. So ABEX means abandonment expenditure, and that's someone else's budget usually. That sits on facility or asset, not wells. So it's new people, it's new techniques, and it's significant spend. Now, the piece that we very, very rarely do is once we go into decommission, the well's gone, the asset's removed from the balance sheet, and we've no productive life there. Now, there's a few basins we see this profile. We see CapEx again. Now, if we go to the Middle East and we look in the Sultanate of Oman, desert, big deserts, subhydrostatic, heavy oil lifted to surface. An operator will decommission a wellbore to then re-drill. If we go into Saudi Arabia and Aramco will decommission the lower wellbore and then re-drill multiple sidetrack exits to then reproduce other targets. So the wells can exceed 60 years old in that case. So you maximize downhole productive reservoir from the same surface facility cost. We now see the transition. We discussed this in the car last night. The energy transition is an interesting concept because you can't turn oil and gas off. And my suit's dyed with hydrocarbon pigment. This is a plastic coating on wood. It's a laptop that's 60% plastic. We can't turn hydrocarbon off. It's entrained into our lives. So one area we've seen some meaningful movement was carbon capture and sequestration. So if you have a large gas plant and you produce significant carbon dioxide, it makes a lot of sense to inject that carbon dioxide into reservoir. That's sensible, let's transition. If you have a city that generates significant CO2, it makes a lot of sense to pump that into reservoir and store it underground. If you pump it 600 kilometers, that doesn't make sense because you have to liquefy in large volume pipelines and it becomes prohibitively expensive. So ultimately, how do we open up post-well life use, new oil development, carbon capture development, and then ultimately when the wellbore's fully redundant, how do we decommission sustainably? And that's what I'd love to talk to you today about. So we'll touch on briefly economics. That's the primary driver. It's a balance sheet discussion. We'll then look at isolation fundamentals, well barriers, subsurface barrier, and how you design isolation to decommission a zone to then reuse above. Then look at techniques. What technologies do you use? What techniques do you use to isolate safely subsurface? We'll look at the structure of operations. I've got a case study on a desert well, and then we'll get into some discussions and conclusions at the end. And I'll try not to overrun. So, risk. It's a risk discussion. We decommission because we have liability in a balance sheet. That liability is financial risk to a company. Ecopetrol has liability. Now, it's on your balance sheet as a long-term liability, and it's under the code of ARO, Asset Retirement Obligation. So this is my second ever well that I executed as an operator, and this is in Oman, in the desert. Now, this has three types of risk. It's got physical integrity risk. So we have metal that can fail. We have barriers that can leak. We've got financial risk. This has got liability on a balance sheet. And the third risk is probably the most visible and most damaging, but the least consequential. It's socio-economic risk. It's the picture of your well leaking that someone takes a video of and then posts online. And your name's forever attached to a leaking well. And that's got significant reputational damage. In many cases, the hydrocarbon leak isn't significant. It damages your brand reputation. So, if we look at this, let's say we've taken this well and we're going to do a well site survey. Now, I can pick up 80% of the risk in this well survey. I don't need to go into the wellbore. And we had a conversation this morning of when you buy an asset without data, how do you handle that? You have to understand the leading indicators of risk at surface. So if I'm here and the well's there, immediately I can see the well's got an issue. There's no cellar. And that gives me a challenge because I can't put a rig across the top of it and run a 3-element BOP, blowout preventer. Okay. I can then see here, I've re-headed the wellhead at some point. This well's had a corrosion or integrity issue in the wellhead. It's been cut off, slip welded. If I then come up into the lower master valve, well, I can see discoloration across bolts. Why would you change 2 bolts on a bolt pattern? You wouldn't, unless you didn't understand how to maintain the well. So I've got risk. The previous operator hasn't maintained this correctly. Okay, that's fair. If I come up to the flange interface, I've got significant discoloration across. I've got leakage coming from here, and I've got a bent double blocking blade. This well leaks hydrocarbon. This well has not been maintained correctly. Is that an issue? Let's see. If we come up, that's a non-API interface. Someone's made this. It's not good. We come into the swab valve. Again, the swab valve has got full hydrocarbon leakage. On the snuff-in box, that's probably non-operable. Okay, so from a risk profile, I see lots of things. But on the left, I see a pump jack. So this is a subhydrostatic wellbore that can't flow to surface. I have to lift it to surface physically. At that point, I can decommission this in a completely different way. I can use single barrier deviations, and I can go and find out within the wellbore because it's not going to flow to surface. So it looks terrible. It's ugly. But it's actually one of the easier cases to decommission because it can't flow to surface. So at that point, if I've got the process and the right people, I can decommission this for less than $300,000. safely. So decommissioning's perspective-based, it's conceptual, and it's context-based. And that's one of its issues. I can't take this approach into the North Sea offshore. Completely different environment. Onshore Colombia, same approach. Onshore United Arab Emirates, same approach. Asia, same approach. Let's go back in time. This is Asia. So I was in Asia for 8 years. So Asia's home for me almost. And this is Malaysia. So in the 1920s, this was how they abandoned wellbores in Sarawak. And it's remarkably similar to present day. So this well has got a 10 3/4 production casing. It looks like a liner actually. It's then got a 13-inch intermediate casing, and it's got a 26-inch conductor. Okay, that's not too dissimilar to what we have present day. In your well stock, you have some of these, I'd imagine. And if we look at the procedure to abandon, well, we're going to drop 20 sacks of construction cement. I still use cement present day. And the volume, I still use the volume present day. It says there's a fishing hole. We still talk in agricultural terms. Step 2, this is interesting. So this is a V0 barrier 100 years ago. So they take a conical metallic plug and they drop it into the liner lap. As that drops, it expands the liner and creates a gas-tight seal. Now today, I run a V0 casing packer or a V0 suspension plug. 100 years ago, you make a conical plug and drop it. On top of that, we put earth, and that's bentonite. That's clay. We still use that present day. We then mix some sacks of cement again, and we put a cement plug on top. We come shallow in the well now to the surface, and we put a temporary plug in. Now, temporary plugs 100 years ago could have been tree stumps, could have been general wooden branches that are crisscrossed. Basic support system to put bentonite on top of. Put 10 sacks of cement, cut the casing at surface, and then weld the plate on. We go to West Texas. That's how you decommission a well present day. So in 100 years, what's changed? Fundamentally, it's exactly the same. It's the same materials, similar construction, and it's the same dual barrier principle. Let's look at economics. So this is a graph of that field we saw in the initial slide. And this shows you how you can get this very, very wrong. So we see initial CapEx investment. We then see development payback. And we then see they've assumed $700 million of decommissioning costs. Now, the problem you have is, how did they come up with that number? This was 1978. That number was created. And the execution of decommissioning was planned for 1998. So with new technology, etc., the decommissioning cost should be lower. Now, the issue this brings is shown on this plot here. If we look at case 1, 800 million of decom cost, that impacts your net present value, which is shown in blue. If your decommissioning cost then slowly scales down, the net present value of your asset increases. So if you get the decommissioning cost wrong when you plan an asset, you may not get financial investment. That's a significant factor. In this case, you also have a rebate. So under British law, they will offset part of your decommissioning cost based on how long you've held the concession. Most countries run this, and it's a stimulus to decommission. So ultimately, enormous spend, very poorly calculated, and year on year it's updated. You look at where the money goes when we decommission. This is Offshore Energies UK. So this is a government body in the UK breaks down the percentage of spend, and we talk about that 800 million. So in this case, it's telling us Item 3, well decommissioning, 51%. That's over $400 million of that spend was in well decommissioning. And the rest comes through various other functions, costs, and processes. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start in the well, and we're going to start in the fundamental differences. So we see here, we drill a well. We drill primary barrier over balanced fluid. We're drilling open hole, secondary barrier, blowout preventer. Fairly standard. When we come into a production well, we've now completed, and we have safety valves in place. Primary barrier, production parker, tubing, safety valve. Secondary barrier in red, biannular cement, production casing, wellhead system, Christmas tree. So they're mechanical, physical things we can test. We can leak off test, we can pressure test. When we come into workover, we put pressure control on. So in this case, we have a coiled tubing intervention, and our coiled tubing BOP is part of the primary well control. Secondary well control is the shear ram. And when we come to decom, we go back to drilling effectively. We start to use formation. We start to use fluid. We start to use cement. So these are non-mechanical barriers we put into the well to re-establish primary control. So what does this say? This says if you're an intervention engineer, you're dealing in things you can measure. If you're a drilling engineer, you're dealing in pressure overbalance your risk. If you're a decommissioning engineer, it should be the easiest well operation of them all, actually. We've got data, we've got barriers we can measure. All we have to do is put plugs across formation. Okay, let's go subsurface. This is one of my wells from Azerbaijan. This was a difficult well. It's a big, deep well. And the subsurface is relatively straightforward, though. So what can we see? It's a sidetracked well. So we can see a 7 5/8 initial well bore. We can see a 5.5 sidetrack tied into a liner top packer. We can see a 5.5-inch upper completion. And the rest of the well, 9 5/8, 13 3/8, 22 by 28. It's a fairly big offshore well to roughly 15,000 feet. The interesting piece is the lithology track. This is where we identify porous sand or areas with potential flow. We have either overburden, benign rock, or we have porosity and permeability in formation. And that's what we start to show via the coloring. We show, again, yellow sand you can pick up. We show shale in brown, and then mud rock in gray. Looking at the well trajectory, it's a fairly basic well. It's a build, hold, dip. There's nothing complex here that would cause us any issues, to be honest. Its departures, fairly small. Now let's look at the pore pressure against fracture gradient and effective mud weight. So we've mapped on reservoir. In this case, one production flow unit only. The rest of the wellbore is non-producing. Now, if we look at the blue track, this is current pressure. If we look at the magenta track, that's virgin pressure. So we can see there's actually 2 flow units in the reservoir that are drawn down at one major reservoir. Okay, there's a few deviances as we look through pore pressure in this area. So if we come into a red track, that's the fracture gradient of sand. So this is our overburden. Now, that roughly mirrors pore pressure. So I'm confident that these are geological issues, in situ stress. Okay, if we then look at brown, this is the fracture gradient of shale. And if we go to gray, this is theoretical overburden mass. Okay, so this is no different to what we do when we drill, or we come to redrill. If we look at the same plot in pressure, so PSI, there's two additions. There's two columns that have now been plotted on. One in long dash, one in short dash. Long dash is your gas column. So this looks at virgin pressure. How does the gas discharge or decharge and depressurize as it moves up vertically in the wellbore? So maximum expected wellhead pressure is this intersect, 4,400 PSI approximately. This dotted one, well, this is our oil column. This is if we let oil flow to surface through the wellbore, how does the pressure decharge? And what we're really trying to do is this in red. We're trying to understand how fluid would behave if it moved up through rock, because this lets us calculate one important depth, which is this. It's called the minimum well barrier depth. So if we assume that this fluid can move behind casing, at what point does that intersect the fracture gradient? I.e., if I have fluid coming up, at what point could it fracture into formation that it's uncontrolled? I.e., underground blowout. And we now start to calculate these points. We have this. If it's sand, at what point does it open sand? We then calculate for shale, and we do the same for oil. This sets our base parameters of where we have to now isolate the wellbore. I need to isolate below here. If it reaches here, it goes off into formation that can permeate up. The next thing we'd look at is flow assessment. So this shows that we have areas with porosity and permeability, but can they flow? Do they have drive behind them? We know there's water or hydrocarbon. And what this track does is this starts to delineate into flow potential and no flow potential. So we can see red here, that's hydrocarbon. Hydrocarbon reservoir, that checks out. We can see here, magenta, non-hydrocarbon, water, pressurized brine. So we've also got some more nomenclature, DPZ. Now, DPZ stands for distinct permeable zone. So it's a zone with permeability. We now have to understand how it's going to behave as we isolate. So in this case, zone 5 has hydrocarbon. We have to isolate. Zone 4, zone 3, zone 2, and zone 1, no hydrocarbon, but they can flow. So my issue is understanding how can this get to this? Because if that gets into there, it can then start to move across formations. So that's a challenge in decommissioning. So if we look to the top right table, this is now trying to tell us thicknesses and quantify what I just discussed. It's saying, okay, we've got seals now. I've got seal 5. Seal 5 is X thickness. And seal 5 I can now use to isolate potential flow zones from each other. Table 3 now looks at inflow. So we've got potential sources of inflow into a wellbore. We've got perforations initially. Where else could we see flow coming in? Because I can't let it go into here. So let's understand that. So table 3 goes through 5 cases, and I've summarized these. Case 1, hydrocarbon inflow through perforation into the wellbore. Okay, well, we mitigate that through fluid. 50 PSI overbalance on well control fluid. Case 2, biannulus cement. The cement behind your 5.5-inch liner. If this has failed, I've got a flow path to the liner top packer element. Okay, this is where I now determine my qualification and my measurement program. I need to measure the biannulus. What do I use? USAT? Do I use passive listening? Do I use ultrasound? Any techniques we can use. Case 3. Okay, case 3 says C annulus cement. If the C annulus cement is incompetent, I can then get up into that distinct permeable zone and flow out. Okay, that's a risk, significant risk. Case 4, similar. Up the C annulus into a higher distinct permeable zone. And then case 5 is shallow movement. If I've somehow managed to connect with DPZ3 and another wellbore, well, that can come into my wellbore now and track up if my D annulus isn't solid. So these are the interactions we get in a field. Single well, plug, disappear. In a field, multiple interactions. It's complex. And this causes issues. Because if we look historically, operators globally have isolated on a case-by-case basis. Sidetrack, lower res of isolation, case and exit, redrill. Many places we see in the world never look holistically, which we'll touch on next. So it's a useful tool internally working with internal teams. It's a plumbing diagram. So it represents multiple wellbores, and we can now assess how flow from one wellbore can access others. So in this case, we can see flow from production reservoir into DPZ3 because my C annulus cement was poor. At that point, it can now run along the formation. If it finds another wellbore with D annulus cement that's poor, it can then track back up towards surface. In this case, we go up to DPZ1. We come into DPZ1 and track along. As long as your D annulus cement is good, there's no risk. If it's poor and there's channeling or there's microannulus, there's significant risk. So it tracks along until it finds a weakness. And then it can get to surface. And that's where we then see surface blowout. We see oil and beach, or we see bubbling gas at wellhead. Difficult situations to go into. So this is why we need to look field-wide when we start to decommission. And the sector, that 1920s well, looked at its own well. It never looked at the neighbor. It never looked at the adjacent block. It looked at itself solely. Okay, back to this well. So how do we design isolation now? The actual barriers. So we do that by understanding this. So we see this track's now come on SPF, sustained flow potential. So we've now assessed, this is hydrocarbon, flows. This is water, cannot flow because there's no aquifer drive behind. DPZ3, non-hydrocarbon, can flow. And then DPZ1, non-hydrocarbon, can flow. Now, many of the standards globally are going to tell us we have to isolate these because you have a connectivity issue, purely. Okay, so what we've done is, we've got this gas column in place that we discussed earlier. We've then come back and said, okay, for distinct permeable zone 3, let's plot the gas column here. And we plotted a second gas column on. We've got flow from DPZ1, so we plotted a gas column on here also. So we've now got 3 areas I need to isolate. 10 minutes ago, it was just cement on the hole. Now it's fairly complex. Okay, so we plot on the minimum barrier depths now, because we have to isolate below. So in this case, we're going to isolate below, and I'm going to put a combination barrier in place. Now this is where we start looking for areas in the wellbore that give the least complexity to access. In this case, I've got open annulus, I've got cemented annulus. So I need to come in, measure through with ultrasonic cement evaluation. If I qualify the C annulus, I'm good. If the C annulus is bad, I need to remove the liner plus the production casing and then mill into open formation. Where does the barrier length come from? So there's no fixed barrier length globally. Each standard, each country, each operator differs. which makes it difficult. If you can't standardize, it's very difficult to replicate and measure success and develop. So everywhere we go, operator preference, regulator preference, government law, and production contract differ. In this case, these are UK spec barriers that we see applied globally. The other major standard is Norsok D10, which is Norwegian-based. Okay, so we're going to isolate the sink permeable zone 3 now. We know the minimum depth, which has been plotted on. And we can then put a single barrier in place in the wellbore. Now again, I chose this location because it's above a production packer. Above a production packer lets me pump through tubing if the C annulus cement is good, or the D in this case. If not, remove tubing, section mill to open hole, set across open hole. And then lastly, the final isolation for the well, isolation 3. This is a fairly long plug, again set below the 22-inch casing shoe, and that gives us full hydraulic seal against DPZ2. Okay, a 3-plug well offshore, that's probably $8 million to go and decommission now, so fairly expensive. What we then do though is we start to optimize. We go, okay, base case, that's what I need. But let's optimize. Can we safely optimize? And that's what we now start to look at next. So what I say is I question. I say, I used the assumption virgin pressure on the reservoir. So that reservoir is fully depleted. So how do I design the pressure on the plug? Let's look at it. So what we have here is, we have 3 different levels of discharge. So 3 gradients. One of them is 100% recharge, virgin pressure. One of them is 50% recharge, and one of them is fully depleted subhydrostatic. So at this point, we need to understand the behavior of the drive behind the reservoir. Will this reservoir ever fully recharge? Is it connected to a neighboring block? Is the aquifer driven from surface? We need to understand that to then set the pressure. Now, most of the UK basin, you would never see 100% recharge. You would see 50% maximum within 40 years as a nominal value. At that point, it would then fall off to fully subhydrostatic, unless you had tectonic movement, which you're lucky enough to have here. So it makes your decommission very difficult, actually, because you're that fragmented in your subsurface. So in this case, what does this do for the barrier? Okay, so if I assume 50% recharge, my combined barrier's moved up. So I was in here prior. I've now pulled the combined barrier up because it isolates below your 50% recharge barrier depth. And I can install it on top of the production packer. So that's a fairly simple, basic place to install. Okay, makes a lot of sense. If I then come up and put isolation 2 in place, well, isolation 2 can still remain roughly where it is. And then we put a small environmental cap in place. So what we've done is we've removed 1 barrier from the wellbore. Now, if you're going to have to run heavy deconstruction to access the formation, you're $3.5 to $4 million you've just saved, because you've looked at how can you compress barrier space. To do this, significant interaction with subsurface team, which, again, across various operators, we don't see. Drilling, completely aligned. Decommissioning, different. It's not normal. So that's how we can design based on various pressure recharge scenarios. Let's look at how you install these barriers now. Again, same wellbore, and we now have a abandonment schematic notified on. This coloring is per Norsok D10, and it's generally adopted globally. Blue's a primary barrier, red's a secondary, green's a tertiary. There's many different tools we'd use, techniques. Sonic logging, very, very old technique, still very good. CPL, VDL, we'd always run with ultrasonic still. qualify and calibrate. So that's one of the core techniques to deploy. Ultrasonic is very, very useful. This ties into the earlier presentation. We've seen USIT and we've seen URS, both products from oilfield service companies. Running sonic and ultrasonic together gives us a good, strong correlation. Caliper, we've seen earlier. Run caliper, it gives me temperature, and it gives me the sense check. Pulse neutron is very, very useful, but very rarely run. If I've got a pulse neutron log, saturation log from well construction, well, I should be running saturation logging in DECOM, because this is going to show me hydrocarbon mobility upwards. It shows me gas pockets that have moved, and it lets me confirm my assumptions on formation. Very cheap technique as well. Single run in memory offline, very, very powerful. I could also use pulse neutron to pick up top of cement if I try to pick up calcium levels. So if I'm running through 2 casing strings on standard CBL, can't pick up TOC. Pulse neutron will let me. Ultrasound. So this is exactly as it sounds. This is medical spec measurement. So lead impression blocks are very confusing when they're run. They don't tell us much. An ultrasound log gives me full spatial mapping of a wellbore fish. So very, very useful tool and technique, actually. If I'm trying to diagnose collapse at a critical juncture, ultrasound's a very, very useful technique. And then lastly, passive listening or acoustic listening. This is listening for movement of fluid behind casing. So if we've got movement upwards, I can detect it through acoustic listening. That lets me understand if there's a fracture through my shale, if my cap rock's not integral. And again, this feeds back into my design of isolation. So for this well, how would we apply these? For my primary barrier, I'd run dual annulus ultrasonic. I'd run sonic to correlate, and I'd run caliper. On the initial well, I'd run saturation if I had saturation logs, and I'd run acoustic listening to qualify the formation to see if there's fluid flow within. If there's none, qualified it solid shale. Contingency, ultrasound would be very, very useful if I got any hang-up. For the intermediate barrier, it's the same recipe. A measurement program across this well is fairly consistent. For the upper intermediate, again, it's the same. Now, if I can do this offline, ahead of decommissioning before there's a rig on site, significant cost saving. So this is generally called phase 0, or the initial diagnostics for abandonment. But the problem you get with that is it sits in someone else's budget. It doesn't sit in abandonment expense, it sits in OpEx. However, that's the basic measurement program we'd run on this well. And this would give leading indicators of risk, then revise design. When it comes to the heavy stuff, cement squeezing is still used globally. The issue we have in cement squeezing is failure rates, high failure rates, because your control of placement is very, very poor when you squeeze. If you've got open annulus, it becomes easier and more effective, but you still have a high failure rate in cement squeezing because you're squeezing through holes, ultimately. Where the cement goes is it's a guess in some cases. Cut and pull, you're going to cut a casing string and then recover it from the well bore. This gives you access to formation, or it gives you access to the next casing string. That gives you guaranteed access. So lower risk, we can then place cement in a more effective way. Section milling, my favorite actually. Section milling scares most companies. Section milling is very simple if it's set up correctly. Section milling removes an interval of casing to allow you to get access to open formation, guarantee cement placement. So these techniques are all about de-risking placement of cement. Pilot milling is nasty. It's slow, it's very expensive, and it's very, very slow. Did I say slow? So 1,500 meters of pilot milling is 20 days in a well site. with an offshore jackup at $250,000 a day. It's an expensive operation. But I noticed in the presentation earlier, fully cemented annuli to surface. When you come into those wells, pilot milling is generally your only option. You have to pilot mill 2,000 to 3,000 meters in some cases. So very difficult. And lastly, perforate wash cementing. This is it's similar to squeezing, but it gives you a higher degree of accuracy and placement. So it lets you run in a cement placement tool and a perforation set below. So you perforate 156 meters of well bore, you'll wash behind to remove barite, and you'll then set a balance plug in place. So it gives you a higher degree of accuracy and placement. You'll then drill the main bore out and log to check your annulus cement. So it's a very popular restoration technique, and it's 5 times quicker than section milling. The drawback on this is you can't use it where you have solid cement. You have to have open annulus, or you have to have unconsolidated cement. Solid cement doesn't work. Okay, same as before. How would I deploy these? In this case, I'd perforate my 5.5-inch liner. I'd displace high vis or high viscosity fluid into the base to give the cement a base. I would then displace a plug into the annulus. That's how I'd re-establish annular cement there. If that wasn't suitable, I'd section mill. I'd section mill 60 meters in the 5.5-inch liner. I'd then run, perforate, and wash. I'd perforate 7 5/8, and then set the barrier using perf and wash. That's probably 13 days of well operations. If that wasn't possible, I'd deconstruct it. I'd mill the top of the liner packer, and then I'd pull the liner. I'd then come in, section mill 7 5/8 to get back to open hole, and I guarantee placement of cement across the barrier. We come into the next barrier. Ideally, this is purely a plug in the packer tailpipe, punch the completion, and then bullhead cement in to set a balance plug if the de-annulus is competent from log. If not, we then recover completion and run perf and wash, or we recover completion in section mill to then get back into open formation. Looking at the intermediate barrier 2, this would be cut and recover completion, cut and recover 9 5/8 casing to give you access to 13 3/8. At that point, I can set a plug if the e-annulus cement is good. If not, I can section mill or I can perforate wash. So various different ways we can apply the technique. The single most important piece is measurement. What's the formation doing? Am I correct with the formation? What's the pressure? Will it recharge? How do I design? Once the design's locked, we can then pick techniques that reduce the risk on placement. We then come and qualify. So we generally qualify through evaluation, ultrasonic and sonic measurement to confirm cement impedance levels. We physically test plugs through hydrostatic tests at positive pressure or negative pressure for inflow. And then we'll physically set weight onto things to confirm height. In this well bore, again, I'd inflow test the first barrier. I'd punch 7 5/8, inflow test the annulus, inflow test the main bore. That's a critical barrier. If it passes, success. If not, we've got an issue. Intermediate barrier, if I've inflow tested the main bore, I'll then hydrostatically test the rest of the bore. So this will be a far less expensive qualification. Hydrostatic test, and then physically set weight on it to confirm height. Intermediate barrier 2, I'll use cement evaluation, ultrasonic, to get bond index, and I'll then positively pressure test, and then set weight on to confirm heights. And your environmental plug requires no qualification, just physical confirmation of placement. Let's look at a well now, the fun piece. This is the well from the the second slide. This is the old lady in the desert. Now, we've seen some issues with that well. This well's construction is concerning. So my issue in the desert, my wife tells me that the desert's too hot. I tell her the desert's got too much water in it. So if we look at Middle East specifically, significant external corrosion on tubulars because you drill through aquifer. In this case, we can see that it's a 9 5/8 production casing set mostly across aquifer. So this is why we've seen the thing had been reheaded. So in reality, there was no integrity in the conductor of this well. There was no integrity in the surface casing either. Now we've seen the space out in the wellhead because there's an emergency hanger set for a scab liner. So we can see 9 5/8. We can see a scab liner run from surface. And then we can see, again, it's a rod pumped completion. I've got a shale at surface, which we don't use because the regulation of the country mandates when my plug goes there. If I come down into the well, I've got 2 shales. The rest of this is water, which is an issue, and it's mud rock or reservoir. Okay, so this was a well in Oman. And this was a very interesting challenge, actually. We'll kind of run through. So the problem this well gives us, where do you isolate? I've only got 2 shales. I've only got 2 shales to come into. One of those shales is 23 meters thick. Okay, so I need to isolate across it, and it's brittle. So if my equivalent circulating density is too high, I fracture and cave it. So this is effectively a drilling engineer got excited in this well and sidetracked incorrectly. Let's look at what we do to decom. So this is the surface equipment. This is a small workover rig. This is super single, and it's 150 kips hook load. So light rigs, similar to what you use in country. This is a 2-inch well control system, small pumping capacity and small tank capacity, because you go into losses in these reservoirs. And then it's temporary equipment comes to the well site, so we reduce costs. If we're looking at the subsurface in this area, this shows you the issue. We can see fully aquifer drilled until we hit the first regional shale, which is Shamar. The second regional shale is Naha Omar. And then the third is Rahab. Now on these wells, I've got 3 shales. That's reasonable. On this side, which is an adjunct block, I've got 2 shales. Shamar is still there. Nahar, Amar, and Rahab have now merged into one shale, which is very thin and slender. So my issue in the well is purely subsurface. And it's caused by this sidetrack. So this sidetrack was drilled out into the first shale and then through the second shale to go and build into a lateral drain hole. The issue that gives me is my primary shale is 23 meters thick now, which is non-compliant to any well barrier standard globally, actually. My intermediate shale is only 7 meters thick. And then my surface is controlled by standard, so I don't need to worry about surface. So to put this in perspective, this is the primary shale. So the degrees, 70 to 73 degrees as it builds through. This is a difficult well to abandon now. Let's take a look at pre and post. Initial design was a combination barrier set on a bridge plug. The actual was the same combination barrier set in a bridge plug. Slight differences in how we executed. Surface plug, bridge plug, cut your surface casing and then circulate in behind. So in this case, 271 meter plug. It's a very, very long interval. It's a balanced plug. Qualification is a hydrostatic positive pressure test, and then it's a physical weight set qualification. If we look at how it executed, so this is 169 hours per plan, 179 hours in execution. So we can see it was 5% over execution, but 42.5 hours for wellbore nuisance. That was nuisance the wellbore created for us. This plot now starts to show you some of these nuisance elements we get with old nasty wells. I had to take a dispensation to put a blowout preventer on. I couldn't pressure test the blowout preventer because the tube and hanger to pressure test against leaked. When we pulled the tube and hanger, there was no seals in the hanger whatsoever. So there's 2 chevron seals plus there's O-rings missing completely. Now I said this is a subhydrostatic well, but there's a picture of crude oil coming to the surface. What we found on this was when we opened the well up, the well started to then breathe on itself. So the reservoir oil contact came 400 meters higher. So when we ran the cleanup trip through, we then started to pump oil to the surface. At that point, I've ruined the pit system at surface. So no potential well control challenge. Just this significantly awkward behavior from the wellbore. And lastly, this is me. This is non-productive time by me. How do you transfer a 15 megabyte log in the desert? Well, sat phone gives you capability. In this case, it wouldn't give us bandwidth. So someone had to drive 2 hours to a hotspot to then email a log to come back. So ultimately, this is the wellbore as it's decommed. We've seen it before. This is the after. Now, the reason the operator decommissioned was to reduce thermal loss. It wasn't to decommission wells. This wellbore was within a polymer flood on a new field development. So any well within that radius had to be decommissioned. There's a thermal loss risk, plus there's a hydraulic loss risk. So in this case, it was purely an integrity operation. Again, 70,000 pounds worth of steel came to surface. It was a fairly simple operation, to be honest, because it was subhydrostatic. Unit cost was less than $300,000 US. So these are fairly simple executions if you understand flow behavior, recharge potential, and well integrity. A few things we can do when we design wells to make it easier and make it less complex. Access to shales, access to formations that you isolate across are key. So how can you design the well so that you can access these in the most simple way? How can you eliminate tubular overlap? How can you do extended leak-off tests at the well construction phase so that I don't need a rig when I decommission? These are all things that have a significant backloaded cost impact, a positive impact. Cement placement, again, cemented the surface across multiple annuli is a nightmare. It's exceptionally expensive to decommission. And if we look to our friends in Brazil, every well gets a first well log. If I've got cement integrity mapping across every annulus, that makes this process significantly easier. So I guess with that, we'll wrap up. So this is a wellbore schematic of the well you see at the start. 1920s well. Per well barriers, it's exactly the same premise as the well on the right, which is the one we've just been discussing through. So in 100 years, nothing's changed with regard to barriers. Nothing's changed with regards to the way we install these, where we install these. It's the same principle, it's the same process. And there's a few challenges that don't help us. There's no consistent regulatory guidance globally. There's no one mandated standard. There's very complex interfaces at legislative level, the regulators to government, to partners. It's a very difficult environment to navigate. There's subjective application cases. And if we look to carbon capture and sequestration, there's a very weak integrity basis on this. What integrity process do you apply to a well you're going to inject carbon through? It's unclear within countries in some cases. So what we have seen is innovation in technology. Measurement, massively improved. Ultrasonic logging through multiple annuli, game changer. That can avoid the need to take a deep water submersible rig on site in many cases. Preparation, remediation, a kind of heavy fishing technologies, we'll say, have increased significantly also to increase accuracy placement. And we can then monitor with sophisticated techniques, fluids, and measurement. And in some pockets of the world, there's been significant development in how do you franchise and standardize. I'd look to Chevron in Thailand, who I executed 2020, 21 with them. It's the most efficient process I've certainly been part of. They executed over 2,000 wells in 2 years. So it's factory decommissioning level. And we see that in pockets, but we don't see it across the sector. So ultimately, to wrap up, it's still Genesis or a custom fit sector. That means it's very expensive, it's subjective, and it's case by case. So that makes it difficult and painful for an operator. You don't really want to do difficult, painful things. You want to drill wells that give you money back that are easier. Massive opportunity to decarbonize. If we can concurrently produce to either pay for decommissioning or we produce more to then offset fuel field cost. And then ultimately, we decommission early. We take assets out because they've got negative net present value. They could be redeveloped into other targets subsurface or certainly carbon capture. This is a difficult sector, fairly simple wells engineering behind it, fairly simple field engineering behind it. It's purely an organizational challenge for us. And with that, I'll end and thank you.
Steven, thank you for your presentation. Now we open for 2 questions. How is the decommissioning of the no conventional?
Sorry?
The no conventional, so it's a massive number of wells. So how is that applying that the decommissioning on that kind of fields?
So
It's a fabric.
So decommissioning on that scale scares operators. So if we look at a case in Australia, there's a large 900 well stock field that needs decommissioned. Now, what we've seen there was the operator said, okay, we can do this. The issues came, there's 4 partners in the field. How do you convince the 4 partners what the cost of the decommissioning is? Okay, so no one knows because there's no data, there's no baseline. Okay, how do I convince the regulator how to do it best? There's no data, there's no baseline. How do I convince the environmental government groups that I can do it safely? Because the issue there isn't the well bores. It's a Class A nature reserve. So you can't leave any surface equipment on. You can't take any contamination in. So the issue is generally the interfaces, government level interfaces, partner, government body, environmental bodies. And without data, how can you do it? So it's very, very difficult, actually. That's why we see more progress in the international basins where there's less regulation and it comes from OPEX spend. The operator says, we're going to decommission, I'm going to pilot. There's no partners involved. They build baseline data, then they ramp into full factory. Where you have congestion on stakeholders, very difficult place.
Thank you, Steven. Any other question?
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about, it has been only applying to conventional production of oil or to conventional production? Because I understand that is applied when the oil is isolated, yes, abandoned, and you start to apply your technology to recover the well, yes? Yeah. But also it is applying to unconventional production of oil?
Yeah, certainly. So if we look at the Permian Basin, the Permian Basin is fully unconventional, large extended reach frac. But also, if you look to Qatar, there's extended reach wells that are fractured also. So high complexity. Well, what we do in that case is we change where we isolate. So we don't isolate in the lateral section. We come back into the heel of the well, into the adjacent cap rock. So the process is the same, actually. We just don't go anywhere near the lateral hole. In most cases, you can't get in. If you could get in, you could never cement. It's very difficult to get back pressure as you cement fully lateral. So we come back into as high as possible into the probably the build section or the kickoff, and then try and isolate there. So process is the same. We'd look at the formations, we'd look at the pressures, and then find out what the minimum barrier depth would need to be, and then pick somewhere that gives us the least complexity there. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Afuera vamos a tener unos refrigerios para que por favor ahí nos acompañen también. Pero antes de irse, una foto con todos aquí, por favor.
Thank you.
Gracias. Oh, thank you, Sergio.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, pleasure. Thank you for being here. We will take a picture with you. Sigan.